Imagine a nation born not from a shared ancient ancestry or a millennia-old kingdom, but from a radical, scribbled idea on a piece of parchment. A nation that started as a fragile collection of isolated farming colonies on the edge of a vast, unknown continent, and within just 2 short centuries, mutated into the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. The story of the United States of America is not a simple tale of steady progress. It is a violent, beautiful, contradictory, and relentless epic. It is a story written in the blood of revolution, the sweat of enslaved labor, the genius of inventors, and the relentless ambition of millions of immigrants who risked everything to chase a mirage called the American dream. From the discovery of a new world to the creation of the atomic bomb, from the battlefields of the Civil War to the crushing weight of the Great Depression, and from the triumph over fascism to the deep divisions of the modern era, this is the entire, unfiltered history of the United States of America. Long before European flags were planted in the sand, the North American continent was a bustling mosaic of indigenous civilizations. For thousands of years, hundreds of distinct tribes, from the Iroquois Confederacy in the dense northeastern forests to the Pueblo peoples of the arid Southwest and the massive city of Cahokia in the Mississippi River Valley, built complex societies, trade networks, and rich spiritual traditions. This world was violently shattered in 1492 when Christopher Columbus, searching for a trade route to Asia, inadvertently triggered the Columbian Exchange. The arrival of European explorers brought horses, guns, and deadly pathogens to which the native populations had no immunity. In the span of a few generations, an estimated 90% of the indigenous population was wiped out by diseases like smallpox, a demographic apocalypse that left the continent vulnerable to European conquest. Over the next 2 centuries, the Spanish, French, and British carved out their respective empires. It was the British who eventually established the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, driven by a mix of economic ambition and religious dissent. By the early 18th century, these colonies had developed distinct identities, from the puritanical rigidness of New England to the plantation aristocracy of the South, all bound together by an overarching loyalty to the British Crown and a rapidly growing reliance on the transatlantic slave trade to fuel their agricultural economies. The seeds of the American Revolution were planted not in a sudden burst of rebellion, but through decades of creeping imperial overreach following the French and Indian War. Having expelled the French from North America, the British government found itself drowning in unprecedented debt and logically concluded that the American colonists, who had benefited most from the war, should help pay for it. A series of taxes, beginning with the Stamp Act and culminating in the Tea Act, ignited a firestorm of resistance grounded in a novel political concept: no taxation without representation. Radical groups like the Sons of Liberty organized boycotts, intimidated tax collectors, and famously dumped British tea into Boston Harbor. As the Crown responded with punitive measures known as the Intolerable Acts, shutting down Boston's port and stripping Massachusetts of self-rule, the colonies realized their individual grievances could only be addressed through unified action. The First and Second Continental Congresses convened, transforming a scattered rebellion into a coordinated revolution. In the stifling heat of a Philadelphia summer in 1776, a 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson distilled the Enlightenment, philosophies of John Locke, into a declaration that changed the course of human history, proclaiming it self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The resulting war was a brutal, demoralizing slog for the underfunded, poorly trained Continental Army. George Washington, commanding a ragtag force that constantly dwindled due to disease and desertion, suffered catastrophic defeats in New York, but managed a miraculous crossing of the Delaware River to secure vital victories at Trenton and Princeton. The tide of the war truly turned with the decisive American and French victory at Saratoga, which brought the full military and financial might of France into the conflict on the American side. After years of grinding warfare in the southern backcountry, the British commander Lord Cornwallis was cornered at Yorktown in 1781, forced to surrender his entire army to a combined force of Americans and French. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized the independence of the United States, granting the new nation a vast expanse of territory stretching to the Mississippi River. Independence, however, did not immediately bring stability. The newly freed states operated under the Articles of Confederation, a loose alliance that deliberately created a weak central government out of fear of tyranny. This structure proved disastrously ineffective, leaving the nation unable to pay its war debts, regulate commerce, or quell domestic uprisings like Shays' Rebellion, where bankrupt farmers in Massachusetts violently protested debt collections. Recognizing that the infant republic was on the verge of anarchy, the states sent delegates to Philadelphia in 1787 for what was supposed to be a revision of the Articles, but instead became the drafting of an entirely new constitution. The resulting document was a masterclass in political compromise, establishing a federal republic with three distinct branches of government designed to check and balance one another. To appease states' rights advocates, they implemented federalism, and to address the deeply entrenched moral and economic reality of slavery, they struck the 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for congressional representation. The Constitution was ratified only after the promise of a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that explicitly protected freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and safeguarded citizens from government overreach. With the unanimous election of George Washington as the first president, the United States began to find its footing, but almost immediately, deep philosophical fractures emerged. Alexander Hamilton championed a strong central government, a national bank, and an industrialized economy, while Thomas Jefferson envisioned an agrarian republic of independent yeoman farmers, fiercely protective of states' rights and suspicious of centralized power. This duality would define American politics for the next 2 centuries. As the 19th century dawned, the nation looked westward, consumed by the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to spread their democratic institutions across the North American continent. The Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon in 1803 instantly doubled the size of the country, and the expeditions of Lewis and Clark mapped the untamed wilderness all the way to the Pacific Ocean. However, this relentless expansion came at a horrific cost to the native populations. Under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 forcibly uprooted tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the Southeast, marching them on the deadly Trail of Tears to reservations west of the Mississippi River, where thousands perished from cold, starvation, and disease. Simultaneously, the issue of slavery was tearing the nation apart. The invention of the cotton gin had made short staple cotton wildly profitable, transforming the South into a one-crop economy completely dependent on the brutal enslavement of millions of African Americans. As the nation acquired new territories, through the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War, a bitter political war erupted over whether these new lands would be slave or free states. The Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 were mere band-aids on a bleeding wound, temporarily balancing the power in the Senate, but doing nothing to resolve the fundamental moral chasm dividing the country. The final fracture came with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a Republican who opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Viewing this as an existential threat to their economic system and way of life, 7 Southern states seceded to form the Confederate States of America before Lincoln even took the oath of office. The American Civil War was the bloodiest and most transformative conflict in the nation's history. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, both sides expected a short, glorious affair, but instead, They got 4 years of industrialized slaughter. The early battles, like Bull Run, shattered any illusions of romance. As the war ground on, Lincoln realized that merely putting down a rebellion was not enough. The war had to be elevated to a moral crusade to destroy the institution of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared that all slaves in rebel-held territory were forever free, fundamentally shifting the war's purpose and preventing European powers from intervening on the South's behalf. The turning point came at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where Union forces repelled General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North in the largest battle ever fought on American soil. From there, Union General Ulysses S. Grant waged a ruthless war of attrition, relentlessly pushing Lee's army back toward Richmond, while General William Tecumseh Sherman unleashed total war on the South, burning Atlanta and cutting a swath of destruction through Georgia to break the Confederate will to fight. In April 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the war. But the triumph was immediately overshadowed by tragedy when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln just days later. The Civil War preserved the United States and abolished slavery, but it left the South in ruins and left unresolved the question of how to integrate 4 million newly freed Black Americans into the social, political, and economic life of the nation. The period known as Reconstruction initially held great promise, as the federal government occupied the South, enforced the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, guaranteeing freedom, equal protection, and voting rights, and saw the election of the first Black senators and congressmen. However, this progress was met with fierce, violent resistance from white Southerners. Paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror and lynching to suppress the Black vote. As Northern fatigue with military occupation set in, the federal government withdrew its troops, abandoning the freedmen to the mercy of their former enslavers. By the end of the 19th century, Southern states had implemented Jim Crow laws, establishing a rigid system of racial apartheid that stripped Black Americans of their constitutional rights and consigned them to a second-class citizenship that would last for nearly 100 years. While the South languished in agrarian poverty, the North and West were undergoing an unprecedented industrial revolution. The Transcontinental Railroad linked the coasts, massive factories churned out steel and consumer goods, and tycoons like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie amassed unprecedented fortunes. Millions of immigrants flooded into Ellis Island from southern and eastern Europe, lured by the promise of jobs, but often greeted with crowded, disease-ridden slums and brutal, dangerous factory conditions. This gilded age of immense wealth and extreme poverty sparked the rise of the labor movement, leading to violent strikes and the eventual birth of the Progressive Era, where reformers pushed for antitrust laws, workplace safety regulations, and women's suffrage, culminating in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The 20th century opened with America stepping onto the global stage. The Spanish-American War of 1898, fought under the guise of liberating Cuba, resulted in the United States acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, marking its emergence as an imperial power. When World War I erupted in Europe, President Woodrow Wilson maintained a strict policy of neutrality, but relentless German submarine warfare and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram finally pushed Congress to declare war in 1917. The arrival of millions of fresh American troops in 1918 provided the decisive boost that broke the stalemate of the trenches and forced Germany to surrender. Wilson traveled to Paris with grand visions of a new world order based on national self-determination and a League of Nations. But an isolationist Congress rejected his vision, refusing to join the League and retreating back into a desire for normalcy. The 1920s roared with economic prosperity, mass consumer culture, the ubiquity of the automobile, and a rebellious explosion of jazz and flappers. However, beneath the glittering surface, the stock market was dangerously overinflated, and wealth was concentrated at the top. In October 1929, the bubble burst. The stock market crash triggered the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. Banks collapsed, farms turned to dust in the Midwest, and unemployment skyrocketed to 25%. The despair of the era shattered the public's faith in unregulated capitalism and propelled Franklin D. Roosevelt into the presidency. FDR's New Deal was a massive, unprecedented expansion of federal power, creating alphabet agencies that provided jobs through public works projects, regulated the stock market, established Social Security, and fundamentally altered the social contract between the American government and its citizens. While America was battling the Depression, the world was again descending into darkness. Fascist dictators Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and militarist Japan were aggressively expanding their borders. FDR provided material aid to the Allies through the Lend-Lease Act, but a deeply isolationist American public refused to enter another foreign war. That stance was obliterated on the quiet Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, when the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a devastating surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The nation instantly unified, mobilizing its massive industrial base into the arsenal of democracy. American factories produced an avalanche of tanks, planes, and ships that overwhelmed the Axis powers. On the battlefields of Europe, American forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of France, and discovered the horrifying reality of the Holocaust as they liberated the concentration camps. In the Pacific, a brutal island-hopping campaign brought American forces closer to the Japanese mainland, culminating in horrific battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa that demonstrated the Japanese military's willingness to fight to the last man. Desperate to avoid a catastrophic land invasion of Japan, President Harry Truman made the agonizing decision to use a terrifying new weapon born out of the top-secret Manhattan Project. In August 1945, the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki vaporized two cities and forced Japan's unconditional surrender, ending the deadliest conflict in human history and instantly making the United States the preeminent global superpower. The end of World War II did not bring peace, but rather the onset of the Cold War, a tense, decades-long standoff between the United States and the Communist Soviet Union. The two nations, armed with nuclear weapons capable of destroying the planet, engaged in a global proxy war, competing for influence in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The American strategy of containment led the nation into the Korean War, a bloody stalemate that established a permanent divide on the Korean peninsula. At home, the fear of communist subversion fueled the Red Scare, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, which ruined lives and chilled free speech. The Cold War also drove an extraordinary era of scientific and technological achievement. The Soviet launch of Sputnik panicked the American public, leading to a massive investment in education and the creation of NASA. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy boldly declared that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the decade was out, a goal achieved in spectacular fashion in 1969 when Neil Armstrong took humanity's first steps on the lunar surface. However, the 60s were also a period of immense domestic turmoil. The civil rights movement, spearheaded by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and John Lewis, used nonviolent protest to dismantle the legal framework of Jim Crow, facing police dogs, fire hoses, and assassinations to secure the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Simultaneously, the escalation of the Vietnam War under President Lyndon B. Johnson fractured the nation's consensus. The televised realities of a brutal, seemingly unwinnable guerrilla war, combined with a massive youth counterculture movement protesting against the establishment, created a deep generational and cultural divide that violently ripped the country apart. The trauma of Vietnam and the disgrace of the Watergate scandal, which forced Richard Nixon to become the first president to resign in 1974, left America in a deep malaise throughout the 1970s, compounded by an oil crisis and crippling inflation. The nation's spirit was revived in the 1980s by the optimistic, conservative revolution of Ronald Reagan. Reagan slashed taxes, dramatically increased military spending, and aggressively challenged the Soviet Union, famously demanding they tear down the Berlin Wall. His massive defense buildup placed unbearable economic strain on the Soviet system, hastening its collapse. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and 2 years later, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The United States stood alone as the world's sole superpower, the undisputed victor of the Cold War. The 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, were characterized by a massive economic boom driven by the rise of the internet and globalization, a period of relative peace and prosperity that seemed to suggest Francis Fukuyama's theory of the end of history, where liberal democratic capitalism had triumphed permanently. That illusion was violently shattered on the morning of September 11, 2001, when Islamic extremists hijacked commercial airliners and flew them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 Americans. The attacks triggered the global war on terror, leading to the swift invasion of Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban, followed by the highly controversial 2003 invasion of Iraq, justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction that ultimately did not exist. These wars dragged on for 20 years, costing trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, becoming the longest conflicts in U.S. history. In 2008, the nation was struck by another severe crisis, this time financial, as the subprime mortgage market collapsed, triggering the Great Recession. The election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president, was a historic milestone that symbolized the nation's changing demographics. But his presidency was immediately consumed by the effort to prevent a second Great Depression, passing a massive stimulus package and the Affordable Care Act. However, the deep political polarization that had been building for decades only accelerated, fueled by the rise of partisan cable news and social media algorithms that trapped Americans in isolated echo chambers. This polarization culminated in the election of Donald Trump in 2016, a political outsider who aggressively tapped into the economic anxieties and cultural grievances of working-class Americans, dismantling traditional political norms and emphasizing an America First foreign policy. His presidency was defined by intense cultural warfare, bitter partisan battles, and 2 impeachments. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 brought unprecedented public health and economic crises, further highlighting the nation's deep divisions over science, individual liberty, and government authority. The 2020 election, won by Joe Biden, was fiercely contested, and the refusal of Trump and many of his supporters to accept the results led to the horrific insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, an event that shocked the world and laid bare the fragility of American democratic institutions. Today, the United States stands at a profound crossroads, grappling with systemic racial injustice, intense political tribalism, an overloaded immigration system, and the looming existential threat of climate change. The American experiment has never been a guaranteed success. From its very inception, it has been a continuous, messy, and often violent argument over what it means to be free and who gets to share in that freedom. It is a nation built on the highest of ideals, yet stained by the darkest of human sins. But its true strength has always lain in its capacity for reinvention, its ability to confront its own flaws, and the enduring belief that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The story of the United States is not finished. It is still being written, carrying the heavy, glorious, and tragic burden of its past into an uncertain but ever hopeful future.